Hello, this is Nick of Time. Welcome to this, our 30th talk in the series. The title of the talk on the website is How to Have an Impact with Relativists. I've expanded that here to say, or anyone else who has a strongly held but erroneous belief system based on logic. The last phrase being critical. If you have a belief system based on faith or emotion or your culture or how you've been brought up, this would probably not have any impact, this technique. Let me give you some background. For many years I debated relativists on the twin paradox, but the only response I got was, "You don't understand special relativity." And I think the dynamics for this situation is that if you have a strongly held belief system, be it correct or erroneous, you consider that equal to the truth. So if someone comes up and presents an argument, no matter how sound the logic is or what the data is, they're arguing against the truth, and therefore, by definition, they're wrong. And that's kind of the mode that people are in when once they've bonded with that belief system. Well, being a quick study, after a mere 35 years or so of making no impact, I realized that nothing I could say, including giving clear, simple laying out of QED logic, or even showing proof by empirical data, would have any impact. So, I changed my approach. I realized that the only way to have an impact was to have the relativist convince himself that his strongly held belief system was wrong. And basically, this is the Socratic Method. If one knows the correct answer to the problem, one can construct a series of questions which will lead the relativist to show himself that relativity is flawed. And of course, you also need to know the relativist's position in detail. As I've mentioned before, the relativists hold 24 conflicting, mutually exclusive approaches to trying to solve this problem. I think everyone perceives it as a problem, and they just fool themselves by coming up with a whole array of conflicting responses and arguments. Case one. I've done a much longer video on this, but just take you through this very briefly, and then next time I'll show how it works in practice. A physics professor that I knew had published a paper alleging that he could reconcile the twin paradox claim with special relativity. And that was published in one of the premier physics journals. The mainstream physics journals have published a whole array of conflicting reconciliation arguments for the twin paradox and special relativity, but no rebuttals to any of them. Well, anyways, the professor was gracious enough to agree to a debate, and he answered my prepared sequence of questions on what he believed. And by the way, this email exchange between myself and the professor was witnessed by Ron Hatch and Tom Phipps, as they were CC'd on both my and his emails. To make a long story short, the professor admitted in writing that his reconciliation argument was wrong. It led to a logical contradiction. This was great, but that's not the end of the story. Initially, I was thrilled because a public retraction of a respected physicist would make the mainstream more open to at least listening to critical thinking and maybe even engaging in a real debate on the issue. However, the professor would not go public. He still has my great admiration for being open-minded and for being candid and putting in writing his admission. In that regard, he's got to be in the top 1%, rarely even in the top 10th of 1% in terms of open-mindedness in the mainstream. So it's really not his fault that he wouldn't go public. It's a human problem aggravated by groupthink. I think once you've published something, it becomes part of your identity. So it's very difficult to retract what you've published. And it's made all the more of a problem, say, if you're a professor in physics academia, because then all of your colleagues have the same ideas, so you'd be considered a traitor and causing them great problems. And there's also the issues of your professional status and your monetary remuneration in the future. And, as mentioned, a number who have publicly admitted and recanted on special relativity have been fired. A further footnote, 2 years later, I reminded the professor of his admission, but he'd forgotten, or perhaps he'd repressed it. However, again, to his great credit, after going through the logic again, he again came to the same conclusion and again put his recanting in writing to me and to Ron and Tom. All right, let's look at another case. A great physicist and critical thinker, one who didn't automatically agree with the mainstream on everything, included a new reconciliation argument for the twin paradox and special relativity in a book that he'd written, a physics book. Again, since we had talked many times in the past, he graciously agreed to a debate, and I asked him a prepared sequence of questions. And, again, he admitted in writing that his argument was flawed. And again, this was witnessed by Ron. I asked him to publicize the error in the next edition of his book, but he would not. So basically, this reluctance to recant publicly something you've published, it's a human reaction, and it certainly includes critical thinkers as well as others. Okay, case 3. Professor 3 had written extensively in favor of special relativity and the twin paradox claim being consistent with special relativity, and quite arrogantly and most insultingly written about Dingle and all others who opposed his views. He agreed to a debate with me, provided that the results would be published in a physics journal, which would be copied on all of our emails. And Physics Journal agreed to this. So that was What he insisted on was the condition for our debate. He assumed he'd prevail and embarrass his opponents, or the dissidents, so-called dissidents. Again, I asked a prepared sequence of questions developed because I knew what his holdings were, and he was putting forth the mainstream standard reconciliation for the twin paradox with special relativity. The standard, even though there are a couple dozen others that are floating around and also accepted. And at each step, he answered my questions in great detail, still very confident. Then, based on his answers, I asked him to do two trivial calculations consistent with his prior answers. The calculations would take less than a minute to do, and we've been going at this for a while because, he wanted to answer everything in great detail so he was not misunderstood. So it took quite a bit of effort on his part to do this, and quite a bit of time passed. So after a long pause, he wrote back that he had to delay responding to this very trivial request to do his 2007 taxes. Well, to make a long story short, despite urging, he never answered. And to me, it's obvious that the reason why he didn't answer, he saw that the two trivial calculations would show a contradiction in his thinking and in the standard mainstream reconciliation argument about the twin paradox claim and about asserting that special relativity described proper time and what was happening physically. So that has made me a real believer in the Socratic Method, as discussed. And just in summary, erroneous but strongly held belief systems are hard to impact, and especially if they're reinforced by groupthink. So that, if you recant, you're really considered a traitor and face serious consequences. So to have any impact, and I believe that even with Professor 3 it had significant impact. He was a changed person after that on these topics, even though he never recanted either privately or publicly. But the belief holder must convince himself, and that, I believe, is possible to do with this method. Even if the belief holder sees an error, he may not recant, even if the belief system is logic-based. So seeing a logic error, really, that's it. Should be that for the belief system. That he may not believe publicly, he may not even recant. He may not recant publicly, he may not even recant privately. So hopefully that will be helpful to some of you. And in the next talk, I'll try and give some details on using this method. Thanks for joining us today.